do this today. I'm also just really excited this year for the Teachin in particular, because this is the first year that we've actually been, that we will be talking about criminal justice reform as an Advocacy Day ask. So part of what I wanted to do with that in mind was give just a kind of general overview of some of the big kind of challenges with the criminal justice system currently. And then we can talk about how did we actually get into this situation where we have such a problem. We'll talk a little bit then about some of the church's social teaching on the issue. And then I'll kind of wrap up by talking about where things stand on Capitol Hill, and we'll walk through the talking points one more time. But before I did any of that, I just wanted to share kind of a story I heard this weekend. I was visiting home for the long weekend, and Jim Martin, of course, everybody knows Jim Martin was in town in my hometown, Scranton, and he was giving a talk. And during his talk, he mentioned one of his friends, another Jesuit, George Williams. Now, George is the chaplain at San Quentin prison in California, and he actually is the chaplain for death row. So he's working with a pretty tough kind of population there. So Jim told these two stories about George and his relationship with the guys on death row. He said, you know, George has been so beloved by these guys that they often ask him if he could live with them full time. And then the other thing that he kind of shared about George and his work on death row is that he was leaving on a Friday one day, George was, and he walked by a cell, and one of the inmates there on death row said to him, "Now, Father Williams, make sure you don't do anything I wouldn't do this weekend." And I just love that story because it kind of really humanizes people on death row, but also people involved in the justice system. I bring that up because we're talking about a population here that really does get demonized quite a bit. I think that's partly because you're talking about a population that for the most part has committed some kind of crime and sort of is viewed as you know, as a problem or dangerous or any other kind of thing. So I think as we go forward, really keeping in mind that these are people that have a sense of humor, that have a family history, that have a life, is really important. And we need to always bring that to the front and center when we talk about the criminal justice system. So with that in mind, let's get started. So the first thing I wanted to do was kind of talk about what is the criminal justice system. There are a lot of questions about what actually constitutes the criminal justice system today. So there are three kind of distinct entities to the criminal justice system. And this graph, I think, lays it out really well. You have your local jails, which house a lot of people once they're arrested and then waiting for trial, or people who've just been convicted and are waiting to be sent to either a state or federal prison. Then you have state prisons, where people primarily serve their sentences. And then you have the federal prison system as well. And then you have a small kind of fourth and fifth category where you have the youth kind of system, which is pretty small, and then immigration kind of system as well. So I bring that up because it's important to recognize that there are kind of different jurisdictions and different government agencies and entities at play, and there is no such thing as one kind of criminal justice system. There's the federal system, there's the local systems, and then every state has their kind of system. And we'll talk more about some of the numbers in this graph later. The other thing I would say too is because the criminal justice system is so vast, we're not going to be able to talk about everything and every element of it today. So today we're not necessarily going to be talking about policing, which is sort of a huge issue. We're not necessarily going to be talking about access to counsel and sort of you know, indigent defense and sort of all the trial-related elements of the criminal justice system, or prison conditions. Those are all really important conversations to have. But I think for today's purposes, we're going to talk more about a few other issues. So why don't we just dive in then? So what is kind of wrong? What's the big problem with the criminal justice system today? So since 1980, we've seen the U.S. prison population increase 500%. So the United States represents about 5% of the total global population, and now we represent about 25% of the global prison population. Now this graph over here kind of shows those three different kind of jurisdictions that I mentioned before. So you see the number of people in jail and then the number of people in prisons. And so according to the Department of Justice's their budget, about 2/3 of their budget is spent on specifically the Bureau of Prisons, which is responsible for housing inmates in the federal system. So currently about 46% of people in the Federal Bureau of Prisons are there for nonviolent drug offenses. So this is going to become really, really important later when we talk about how did we get to this point and how did we find ourselves in this kind of problem. You know, and today we have so many people locked up that 1 out of every 25 kids has a parent in jail or prison. It's gotten so bad that even Sesame Street had to run an episode on to help kids deal with the reality of their parents being in prison or jail. Another major problem with the criminal justice system today is the racial disparities present in it. So people of color make up about 30% of the U.S. population, yet they make up 60% of people in prison. So based on current statistics and current trends, 1 in 3 Black men will be incarcerated at some point in their lives. And all of this is despite that there is no meaningful difference in crime rates between races. In fact, according to the Drug Policy Alliance, African Americans comprise only about 14% of regular drug users, yet they represent 37% of all people arrested for drugs, for drug possession or drug use. So that we can talk about later as well. So another big kind of problem with the criminal justice system is recidivism rates and barriers to reentry. So recidivism refers to people coming back or recommitting crime once they're released from prison, and barriers to reentry refer to all the things that get in the way of someone successfully reintegrating into society. So over 630,000 people are released from prisons or jails every single year. And currently the recidivism rate is about 67% within 3 years and 78% within 5 years. So more than 2/3 of people released from prison or jail are going to recommit some kind of crime based on current trends within the first 3 years, and then 78 within the first 5 years. And so why does this happen so frequently? A couple reasons. First, since the Bureau of Prisons is forced to spend most of its money simply on maintaining and housing inmates, they have had to cut on programming within prisons themselves. So there are fewer programs to help people get a GED or take college courses. There are fewer programs for mental health and addiction treatment. There are fewer job training programs. We've seen a consistent kind of cutback in the budget for programs like that because we have just so many people involved in the prison system. Additionally, I mean, we've been seeing that more and more people going into the criminal justice system are going into the criminal justice system because of crimes related to addiction or mental illness. And then we're also seeing sort of the criminalization of poverty. So if you look at the chart that I put up on this slide, it shows the annual incomes for people who are incarcerated, well, incarcerated men versus non-incarcerated men. And you'll see that 57% of incarcerated men currently earn less than $22,000 a year. Now, the federal poverty line is about $40,000 for a family of 4. So that just puts this kind of into perspective. So what's happening is that more and more people of color, first of all, and then second of all, people who are coming from low-income communities are ending up in prison. And so the other thing, too, to keep in mind here is what we call collateral consequences. So a collateral consequence is basically something that happens to an individual who has been convicted of a certain crime and has a criminal record. So currently there are over 30,000 state and federal, and even some local collateral consequences. Now these can range from anything like having your voting rights taken away, not being allowed to qualify for Pell Grants to help you go to college, not qualifying for food stamps or welfare or Section 8 or for housing, But they also can include things like professional licenses. There's a story of one prison, I believe it's a federal prison in Louisiana, that has a really good barber training program. So it's training inmates on how to cut hair with the hope that they then can leave prison and then start their own businesses or join an existing barber shop within the community, which sounds wonderful, and a lot of inmates are involved. But Louisiana state law has a collateral consequence of a criminal record that states you can't cut hair, you can't be a barber if you have a criminal record in the state of Louisiana. So there are so many different things that make it more difficult for people to successfully re-enter their community. And so since we're inadequately addressing mental health and addiction and lack of education and all these other sort of things in the system, and then we expect people to somehow thrive once they're released in communities that are too poor to provide the necessary services, that's what I think leads to a lot of these kind of recidivism rates. You can't expect people who aren't prepared to successfully come home successfully. So next, I wanted to talk briefly about the death penalty and extreme sentencing. I bring these up because they're two very kind of unique things about the U.S. criminal justice system. There are a lot of unique things about our system, the size and the scope and all that, but these two in particular, I think, are really troubling. So, you know, if you look at the map, that shows all of the different countries that have capital punishment on the books as a law, as a possible consequence of crime. Unfortunately, the United States executed 28 individuals last year, which made us the 5th leading executioner behind China, Iran, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia. So that's an old graph on the bottom. So you just replace Iraq with Pakistan. You know, we were actually the only country in the Americas to execute anyone for the 7th year in a row. And so far, 15 individuals have been executed in 2016. So we expect more people to be executed by the new year. And this is really troubling because new data has shown that 1 out of every 20 death row inmates is likely innocent. So there's been studies to look at exoneration rates, to look at DNA and all these other kinds of things. And they found that 1 in 20 death row inmates are likely innocent. So not only do we have the unwanted distinction of being the only sort of major developed nation that uses this punishment, we're also using it on people who, frankly, have not, in some cases, have not committed the crimes that they are to be killed for. And then racial disparities are also extremely present in this as well. You're more likely to get the death sentence if you're black than if you're white. If the defendant is black versus white, all those kinds of things apply here. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about here, I put up a map of all of the countries in the world that have the practice of sentencing juveniles to life without parole sentences. So we are the only country in the entire world that actually sentences young people to die in prison. So there are stories of someone as young as 15, 14 years old being given a mandatory life without parole sentence. So they will sit in prison until the day that they die. And so currently we have about 25,000 individuals serving these sentences. But there is good news. The Supreme Court has ruled on a number of occasions in the past few years that a mandatory life without parole sentence is unconstitutional, and that it should be made retroactive so that everybody who is currently serving one of those sentences can petition for a new sentence, which is great success. But still, life without parole sentences are an option for judges in cases with juveniles, unfortunately. Finally, the last thing I wanted to talk about here was the use of just life without parole generally, so for the adult prison population. So since 2008, the number of people who are in prison with life without parole sentences, serving life without parole sentences, has increased 22%. So now about 50,000 people are serving mandatory life without parole sentences. So those are people who committed a crime and the judge didn't have any jurisdiction, and all the judge can do is say, well, you committed X crime, and therefore you get this sentence. So about 50,000 people with those sentences, and then 159,000 people with life without parole sentences, generally. So it's sort of a huge kind of problem. Pope Francis made the news about a year and a half ago or 2 years ago when he talked about life without parole sentences as a hidden death penalty. And there's a lot of truth in that. So you're telling a person that they have no future, and that their crimes are so heinous that they can't change, and that they're going to spend the rest of their life institutionalized, which causes all sorts of problems. Oftentimes, people serving these types of sentences are, lash out because they have no future and have no hope. So it makes a prison more dangerous. It's a tougher job for correctional officers. It's more dangerous for fellow inmates. And frankly, the suicide rate for people with serving these sentences is much higher. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about how we got here. And to do that, we have to talk kind of about the politics of mass incarceration. So this is a bipartisan issue, or historically this has been a bipartisan issue. Both parties have tried to outdo each other on being tougher on crime. So you could go all the way back to 1968 with Ronald Reagan saying we must reject the idea that every time a law is broken, society is guilty rather than the lawbreaker. It's time to restore the American precept that each individual is accountable for his actions. And that'll become important when we talk about the next slide. And then you even have Joe Biden in 1994 when he was a senator saying, let me define the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. The liberal wing of the Democratic Party is now for 60 new death penalties. The liberal wing of the Democratic Party has 70 enhanced penalties. The liberal wing of the Democratic Party is for 100,000 cops. The liberal wing of the Democratic Party is for 125,000 new state prison cells. So this is a rare kind of issue in which both parties have historically been equally as guilty of leading to the situation we're in. But the bright spot here is that since both parties have been equally guilty, both parties, I think, feel freedom and feel like they have to take a certain ownership of fixing the problem, which is why this is a really exciting year to be talking about criminal justice reform on the Hill. And we can talk about that in a few minutes. So what led to those kinds of comments that I just read to you? What kind of changed in American culture and in American politics that allowed a sitting governor and Ronald Reagan to say that, and Joe Biden 20 plus years ago say that? So we have to go back to the 1960s here. In 1964, President Lyndon Johnson launched what was called the War on Poverty, which is the largest expansion of government programs since the New Deal. And this coincided with the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War. All of this making the 1960s a very, very tumultuous kind of time. And so, fed up with the lack of progress on civil rights and President Johnson's decision to take funding away from the War on Poverty to pay for the war in Vietnam, activists all over the country, especially civil rights activists in urban communities, started launching major protests, and in some cases these turned into riots, and sort of created this cauldron of really, I think, the country feeling like they didn't know which direction they were going. Are we moving forward? Are we moving towards a more positive future? Are we going backwards? Do all Americans have a stake in the society? Are we actually addressing poverty? Does passing some civil rights bills has it actually made that much of a difference for people of color? And it created all these kind of questions. And the riots and the protests sort of hit a nerve, I think, with a lot of, unfortunately, white America at the time. So much of white America was kind of appalled by what they saw and couldn't understand why this was happening. Didn't we spend all this money to fight poverty? Didn't we pass a number of civil rights bills? Didn't we do this? Didn't we do that to help make people's lives better? which in reality is just another form of white privilege to kind of say, look, we did all this, why are you upset? And so this also coincided with an uptick in crime. And in other words, it was kind of a perfect storm for some elected leaders to pivot to fighting not a war on poverty or a war in Vietnam, but a war on crime, in particular a war on drugs, because we saw sort of the expansion of the drug market in the United States at this time. And so over time, the people that the war on poverty was targeting specifically to kind of uplift and empower became some of the targets of the war on crime and the war on drugs. And this has led to what we talked about earlier, prisons full of people of color, the poor, people who have addiction problems, the mentally ill, and we kind of get what we asked for here. In the 60s, then Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy had this quote in which he said, "Every society gets the kind of criminal it deserves. What is equally true is that every community gets the law enforcement it insists on." So it's kind of a harsh quote, but when you think about it, every society is getting the kind of criminal it deserves. What does that say about our society here? We've prioritized locking people up for drug crimes and prosecuting a war on drugs. And so therefore the type of criminal that is filling our system is a low-level person convicted of a drug crime. In many cases, someone who has an addiction problem. And so this has also led to the type of law enforcement that we're getting. If we say that low-income people of color are criminals, then we put more law enforcement in those communities, and we start to see, surprise, surprise, that when you put more police in a particular community, you're going to find more crime. It's not that people in these communities are committing more crimes than people in other communities. It's just simply that when you allocate resources to one area more so than another, you're going to get different outcomes there. And so it goes with police. So what are some of the tough on crime laws that legislators put in place at this time to kind of create the problem we have? So we have mandatory minimum sentencing laws. So these are laws that basically say, if you commit a certain crime and you are found guilty, a judge has to impose a particular sentence. And a lot of these mandatory minimum sentences apply to, again, what we're mostly talking about, drug crimes. So this has taken away a judge's ability to look at the facts of the case in a meaningful way. So a judge can no longer look at some of the circumstances that might have led to the crime. They can't look at the educational attainment levels of the person on trial. They can't look at whether this person was abused as a child, or whether this person has a long history of addiction, or any of these other kind of factors, because they're told by law, if this person's guilty, they have to go to jail for 5 years, 10 years, 25 years, life. And so mandatory minimum sentences have really led to the uptick in the numbers of people entering the criminal justice system. And I give one specific example below it, the Rockefeller laws, to kind of highlight how racialized mandatory minimum sentences have been historically. So the Rockefeller laws refer to the sentencing for people convicted of crack cases versus cocaine cases. So crack versus cocaine, there really is no meaningful difference between the two drugs, chemically speaking. They're essentially the same kind of thing. But there were mandatory minimums placed on crack charges that were 100 times stronger than for cocaine offenses. And so you have people who committed essentially the same crime getting a sentence that is 100 times stronger than somebody else. And to no one's surprise, there's sort of a racial tinge to this, because crack was very, very present in urban communities of color, in particular, poor communities, whereas cocaine was sort of thought of as the kind of the drug of choice for the upper class. So it's truly just a racial kind of calculus made there. We also have what's called a truth in sentencing law. So these are laws that state that when someone is convicted of a crime and they get a sentence of, say, 10 years, they cannot qualify or ask for parole or early release until they serve 85% of their sentence. So this has just extended people's stay in the prison system. It's made it more difficult for people to qualify for early release for good behavior or other kinds of things. Of course, we've seen the emergence of all of these different collateral consequences, taking people's right to vote away, and the like. Ban the box. We've seen sort of the emergence now of the ban the box movement, which some people might be familiar with. On many employment forms, you see a little box that asks if you have a criminal record or a criminal history. And this has really gotten in the way of people coming out of prison, finding jobs. And so there's a movement underway, and we'll talk about it because it's part of the talking points actually for the Teachin, to not allow employers to ask that question right out of the gate when someone's applying. And then also policing policy. We've seen stop and frisk, which has thankfully been stopped in places like New York City, but also just placing more police officers in poor communities and communities of color, and being surprised when we find that, we find crime there. Like I said earlier, if you put more police officers in a particular community, you're more likely to find more crime. We could expect the same thing to happen in sort of suburban America if we policed suburban America the same way we policed urban America. And then also the criminalization of mental health and poverty. All right, so quickly, we'll talk about some basic principles of Catholic social teaching on criminal justice reform that have really informed what we're going to be talking about at the Teachin during the Advocacy Day. So the USCCB in 2000 wrote a great document that I hope some of you might consider looking at before you come to DC. It's called Responsibility, Rehabilitation, and Restoration. And in it, they laid out a number of principles that ought to guide policy decisions around the criminal justice system. So the first thing they say is that the governments have a duty to protect all citizens. So a pretty basic kind of statement. Then they call for a rejection of simplistic solutions. So those mandatory minimums that don't allow a judge to actually look at the individual and look at all the circumstances of their case, that would be a simplistic solution. 3 strikes laws, which basically say if you commit 3 different crimes and one of them is violent, you automatically get a life sentence. Those would be considered simplistic solutions from the church's point of view. They also call on governments to promote crime prevention and poverty reduction, because oftentimes the two go together. And then it calls on all of us to challenge the culture of violence and replace it with a culture of life. So how do we, all of us, try to live our life in a way that is nonviolent, in a way that sort of promotes the best and the well-being of all in our community? And then also, grant space for victims to participate in the criminal justice process, both because it, in some cases, allows for the healing of the individuals the victims of crime, but also because in some cases it allows for real rehabilitation of people who've committed crime through restorative justice programs. And so that's why they call for a promotion of restorative justice programs. And then also the church and the bishops in the U.S. have insisted that punishment must be constructive and rehabilitative. So that means that things like the death penalty are totally off the table, or life without parole, totally off the table, because how can there be rehabilitation when that's it? The death penalty, there is no coming back from that. There can be no rehabilitation with that. Or life without parole, if you have no chance and no opportunity to come out of society, how can we say that you can be rehabilitated? How can we say that that's constructive? Then they also call on government to address addiction and mental illness. And then finally, to empower local communities to address the issues leading to crime. And you'll hear some presentations at the Teachin from community leaders and community organizations, and learn how they are trying to address issues leading to crime in November. And so then Pope Francis has kind of given his own little spin on some of the criminal justice issues. So, when he spoke to Congress a while back, he offered encouragement to all those who are convinced that a just and necessary punishment must never exclude the dimension of hope and the goal of rehabilitation. He's also said at other times that God is in everyone's life, even if the life of someone has been a disaster, even if it is destroyed by vices, drugs, or anything else. And so Pope Francis has talked about this, frankly, more so than I think any other recent pope, which is a really exciting kind of time. Actually, just yesterday, he was tweeting about the death penalty. So if you go to his Twitter handle, you can look at some of those tweets. So what is happening on Capitol Hill, and what are we going to talk about when you get here in November? So as I mentioned earlier, both parties are equally to blame for this problem. And so I think it's freed up both parties to take ownership and try to address criminal justice reform. And so we've seen a number of bills in both chambers of Congress that are all bipartisan. And we hope that they'll be voted on this year. We were hoping that there would be a vote actually in September. That didn't happen. So now we're holding out and doing a lot of work to make sure that some of these bills have a chance of being voted on after the election, but before the inauguration. So sometime between November and January, which means that all of you coming to the Teachin are going to be coming at exactly the right time to be talking about criminal justice reform, because we're going to need your voices to go and talk to congressional staffers about the importance of criminal justice reform. And so there are a couple bills in particular that have been moving through and will hopefully continue to move through Congress. I'll talk really briefly about them. So in the House, you have the Sentencing Reform Act, which is a way of addressing mandatory minimum sentences. So it gives judges more freedom to say if somebody actually qualifies for a mandatory minimum, or if the circumstances of the case don't need or call for a mandatory minimum. So it's not cutting the length of those mandatory minimums, which we would hope for, and which so many organizations like the Jesuits are calling for, but it does give judges more freedom to get people out of the mandatory minimums, which is a good thing. They also have the Recidivism Risk Reduction Act, which would require that the Federal Bureau of Prisons provide an individual risk assessment of recidivism for everybody who comes through their doors. So it will categorize all the different challenges somebody might face and help an individual tailor a program while they're in prison to make it less likely that they're going to come back to prison when they are released. Then the Second Chance Act, which is basically a funding source and a funding stream for programs that help people find their feet when they come home, whether it's housing, whether it's job training, whether it's mental health or addiction treatment. And so in the Senate, they have similar bills. The Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act combines the Sentencing Reform Act and the Recidivism Risk Reduction Act in the House, and then also the Second Chance Act. So these are kind of the bills that are likely to move forward, but these are not necessarily, we're not asking that you go to Capitol Hill and ask that they pass these particular bills. Why is that? Because while these bills are good, they aren't all that we're asking for, and they only represent a really, really small step forward in criminal justice reform. So we're hoping that you can go to the Hill and really be bold and really ask for some really, really good reforms that make the system much better rather than a little bit better. So the first part of the ask for the Teachin is the positive side, right? So this is what we're hoping that you will support: getting rid of the death penalty and life without parole sentences, reducing and ultimately eliminating mandatory minimum sentences, ensuring that everybody receives programming support they need to adequately re-enter society, more funding for programs to support formerly incarcerated individuals, and then ban the box for job training, and then addressing all the other collateral consequences like bans of food stamps and welfare and housing, all those kinds of things. But then we're also asking you to let lawmakers know that we're opposing any further cuts to funding for prison programming and reentry services. So funding for these programs is already stretched so thin that trying to find more savings in the budget by cutting more from prison programming is only going to hurt us in the long run. It's only going to make it more difficult for people to go home and only make it more likely that once they do go home, they're going to come back to prison. And finally, we also want you to urge lawmakers to create no additional penalties or barriers that make it more difficult for an individual to go back home. So we don't need more kind of rules that say someone who committed a crime can't do this or can't do that. And then just something to be aware of, and this is something that we'll talk about at the Teachin through different breakout sessions. You know, there are some lawmakers who, instead of getting on the bandwagon and supporting reform, are doubling down and clinging to those failed tough on crime policies. So some of them think that instead of actually doing anything about mandatory minimums, we need to increase mandatory minimums. We need to, you know, make them longer and tougher, and you shouldn't be spending money on programs for people who committed crime. And so just sort of saying to staff, this is a reality and it's a big problem, and we need you to be constructive and work with your fellow legislators to move the ball forward. So that's kind of all I've got. I know it's a ton of information, and I went kind of over time, but we do have time for question and answer a little bit. I'm happy to talk about any elements of the talking points, any part of the presentation I gave, or other parts of the criminal justice system that you're interested in.
Folks, I am unmuting your phones now, so you should be able to ask Matt a question directly. If it's not allowing you to speak, you can also use the chat function, and I'll relay that message. Any questions from the group? And folks, if you don't have a question, if you can mute yourself. Question?
Hey, I just emailed you.
Oh, you found it. I'm surprised to see you here. Let me just take this call.
Sure. I'm on the webinar anyway.
Yeah, I did. The bad word. You're gonna listen to that.
All right, Matt, it looks like we might not have any questions at this point. So I'd like to offer up to folks the ability to follow up with you. If you have any questions, does that work for you? Or if they have any questions? Yeah,
so the best way to follow up with me is by emailing me. And my email is mcuff@jesuits.org.
Great, thanks, Matt. And we will be posting this webinar to the website by mid-next week, if not earlier, so you can follow up with Matt after reviewing this as well. So thank you so much, Matt, for a great presentation on how we got here and taking us through some of the talking points in Catholic social teaching. We really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today, so thank you.
Thanks for having me.
And to the folks on the call, we really appreciate you being here as well. We hope that the rest of your preparations for Advocacy Day go well, and we're looking forward to sending you and 1,200 other people to the Hill to advocate for criminal justice reform and immigration reform. So thank you all, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care.